This video starts with a short clip from the Searle Hadamech collection of conversations with the famous Norman Maclean, sadly no longer with us, but well known as a writer, singer, piper, actor, comedian, and all-round entertainer. After the clip comes a discussion between linguists at universities in Scotland, India, and Jamaica working together on the Mediating Multilingualism project, and other interested individuals with a close professional, parental, or community involvement in language and languages. First, here's Norman.
It's all the car who can scoot. I was on the even senior condio. I was so the vacuum so as the legit and but no enjoy your hockey been involved the color sheet channel show. I was be secretary na shower Kavi Toy Iran show as a rotun doing je prin Gaelic. Bisschen forsten we down na leju. I was han Michel Rogoch so richted. Geleerd is zien. Goeie se bi. Roet na kavargu. Han je daar geet. Ha uret de gewoon kaufe is toch een scholig. I was ha was of dat Gane indigenous, gane nieuwe, ik heb het kaartje toch gedaan. Ah, we hebben kaartje moet je gevleien, maar hij gewoon maar schieten in beelden. Charlotte, hij kon juni ermse, en de vond is me. Toen jaar kwam heel Katrien. Jaar heen en is beheerd. Hij is hem, maar vriendjes mee die, toen is ze bij. Runich, Narayana, zomaar, has been a crochy and I shoot. In joon, Harutbek na Shinja na Daichet Plione. And check one, put the bring to on the Gaelic. Staff han a solke na Shin. A Karen Kukolog. Stoke frikker at toe, can yet. Hallo Iris, come here, how would you? Gaan het er rot in de korf, maar gaan goed daar, hij voerde mooi. Hij zat krat gehuikschen. Ach, hij is een fijn vibe. Dat je het gekonstel, het brinkarik. Hij is geboos, je wat te gaan, had het schoen gepeld.
Hello, I'm Gordon Wells. I'm the project manager for SAILSE, the Inter-University Research Partnership for the Maintenance and Revitalisation of Scottish Gaelic. Here's our panel. Conchúr Ó Giollagáin is Gaelic Research Professor at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland and the Director of the UHI Language Sciences Institute and of the SAILSE Network. Udaya Singh is Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and Chair Professor of the Amity Centre for Linguistic Studies at Amity University, Haryana in India, and formerly Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Visvabharati, Shantiniketan, and Director of the Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore. He also has a keen interest in creative writing. Joseph Farquharson is Senior Lecturer in Linguistics in the Department of Language, Linguistics and Philosophy at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in Jamaica. He is also the coordinator of the Jamaican Language Unit and the Unit for Caribbean Language Research. Jane NicLeòid was raised speaking Gaelic and later English as well on the Isle of Lewis. A trained teacher, she worked on the mainland for some years before recently returning to her home island, where she continues to teach Gaelic and is also closely involved in the new pressure group Conchúr Ó to promote the interests of vernacular speakers. Kalyan Das Gupta was raised in Kolkata, speaking Bengali, Hindi, and English, and spent a large part of his professional career running community interpreting services, first in Edinburgh and later in Lewis and London. Audrey West's first language is Jamaican, and she's qualified to teach Spanish and French, as well as in cultural memory. This gives her an awareness of the intergenerational post-trauma resulting from the transatlantic practice of enslaving Africans for European colonial gain. Resident in North Wales, she worked as an artist, poet, linguist, psychotherapist, trainer, and community development practitioner. They're not competing teams at all, but we've got folk speaking from dare I call them ivory towers, but we've also got folk speaking from beyond the towers, and we think that's important to have that mix, particularly when we're talking about language in a community or social context. So I'm very grateful to all of you for agreeing to actually take part in this. Right, so I'm going to ask Crocker to kick off with this, just to make the point, before he does that though, that what we've just seen is a shortened version of the segment which we've actually all seen beforehand, which it lasts 7 minutes, and it will be referring to that longer clip when we actually have this discussion around language endangerment and the Gaelic trajectory.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And if I could just start off by thanking our colleague, Gordon Wells, for bringing us all together today to discuss this important topic. And I think it's highly appropriate that we use a clip from Norman Maclean's recordings to further engender the debate we're going to have on these issues. As Gordon said there earlier, Norman Maclean was an extraordinary person, and it was a privilege for me to know him. My only regret is when I came to know him first, my Gaelic wasn't that good at that stage. So I was able to listen to him all right, but I wasn't really able to participate at the level of social exchange. But he had extraordinary skills, qualities, and talents. Gordon has mentioned them: a piper, singer, actor, performer, writer, novelist. But also he was a very, very witty raconteur and a very astute observer of the human condition. And I think that's why his opinion of what happened to the Gaelic world is very important. He's basically, in that short clip, and I know the longer recordings are available to everybody, I'm sure people will want to look at them, but his astuteness in observing the transformations that have happened to the Gaelic world and during his lifetime is very compelling, and it actually reflects many of the research findings and research insights in the book, the Sociolinguistic Survey we published last year, The Gaelic Crisis in the Vernacular Community. I took 5 things, basically, 5 points from what Norman has set out there. The implications of the social change since the 50s, then the changes to the proportions or the social densities of Gaelic speakers in the last remaining vernacular social geography, that is mainly in the islands, in the Western Isles in particular. Then issues in relation to how the young are socialized in a minority culture in the context of language contact. In other words, their contact with speakers of a much stronger language. And then the difference between having a language competence and having a vernacular ease. In other words, that you have a comfortable facility to partake in an actual speaker group or a speaker community. So he hasn't studied these issues in a systematic way that many of us around the table here have studied, but he's come to a fairly accurate way of portraying and understanding what has happened to his own community. And I'll just say a few points on each of them before we open it up to a broader discussion. He talks of what has happened to the Gaelic community in his area, in the Isles, since the 50s. And this is quite a common theme in minority sociolinguistics, that we see the socioeconomic processes of modernization. These have been very disruptive for minority language groups in the sense that they are not able to manage the rate of social change in a way that protects their own social integrity. In other words, how do they maintain the integrity of the socio-cultural group and undergo modernization at the same time? There's a base that is a universal or a global theme of endangerment that many minority groups deal with. It's interesting also, he talks about the turning point in his culture from the 70s onwards. And we saw this in our own Gaelic crisis study. It's indicated quite clear from the census data on the proportions of Gaelic speakers in the islands from the 80s onwards. But our study, the Gaelic crisis study, actually indicated that this process started in the 70s. It became clear in the 80s, though. And that's brought us to the stage, if I can just talk a bit about the demolinguistics of the Gaelic crisis study. The speaker group, the vernacular speaker group in the Gaelic communities, is now around 11,000 people. But more troublesome or more worryingly is that the younger cohort that indicates an ability in spoken Gaelic is now below 2,000 people. So that 2,000 young people left in the vernacular context, and you can see where the issue of endangerment comes from there. If we move on then and look at the issue of the changes in the proportions of the social densities of the Gaels in their social geography. And he makes this point that he thinks in his own community now that less than half the houses we could ascribe Gaelic speaking to them. That's probably an optimistic analysis, taking all of the Western Isles together. However, we do know that there is a bias in his area, Grimmassai, towards the more mature age cohorts, if I'm to put it delicately like that. And that ties in with his point also about people over 40, 50-ish being more comfortable in Gaelic than the other age cohorts. But it's interesting, if you thread together all the points he's making this link between a high social density of speakers, the home transmission of a minority language, the link beyond that then to the communal practice. In other words, if you have high densities of home transmission, then you are more likely to have a situation where the youth in that culture are socialized in the minority language. So he's showing great awareness of many of the key themes in sociolinguistic revitalization and regeneration for the threatened groups. Moving on then to this issue of how change happens. And he refers to this also, that generally change in minority groups happens through the introduction of new social players into a traditional society. And he refers to the social role of the lowland children in the playground of the schools in his area. And what we're seeing essentially there is that the bilingual Gael has been integrated into the monolingual social networks of the English dominant or the English speakers rather than the other way around. And we see this often in sociolinguistics, that the minority accommodates to the more favored language, to the majority language, rather than the other way around. And even to this day, there are obvious gaps in sociolinguistic insights that do not address that issue properly. Why is there one-way traffic in the language contact issues of how the majority group deals with the minority group? Moving on then, the implications for the minority culture for this issue of social subordination. So when you see a minority group accommodating to the requirements of the majority, you're essentially seeing the process there of social subordination. And it is in this context where we see what he means by this point he raises, that it's now exceptional to hear young people, children in his area, speaking Gaelic in a social setting. You might hear them speaking it in a school setting or in a cultural or performed setting, but the normal day-to-day vernacular use is now, for a man who grew up in a high-density social milieu of Gaelic speakers, he now finds it, he found it at that stage exceptional to hear young people speaking Gaelic. That links us to his final point, and it's a very, very important point. both for Gaelic culture and, again, a global issue of sociolinguistic importance for the revitalization or the continuity of the minority threatened groups. It's this difference between having a competence in a minority language and having a vernacular level social ease in a minority language. They're not the same thing. He makes this issue that the people over 40 who had experience of growing up in a social milieu of Gaelic speakers, they have much more ease in the day-to-day use of Gaelic. The under 40s then, who have less experience of seeing Gaelic being used in high social densities and in a wide variety of social domains, he feels that they do not have the same type of competence in Gaelic. Again, this is a very astute insight. Having a comfortable facility in the minority language comes generally, not always, but generally from being socialized in a high density of speakers. But what are the implications for today then in Thurman's insights?
You're coming to the summing up now.
I am indeed, yes. I think the issue here for minority languages that are supported by public policy and public resources, in other words, projects of revitalization, if Thurman, and now, as I say, an astute observer of the minority culture, if he is aware of it, the academics are aware of it, it's obvious then that those in charge of public policy and public support mechanisms for the Gaelic group must be aware of it also. Why then do the insights that emerge from the community not filter down to the policy level, where the policy, people in charge of policy, people in charge of public bodies can interact and deal with the actual issues as they are understood and as they are felt in the community? What is this impediment in official promotion efforts that prevents or hinders official bodies from dealing with the reality? And this is, I use this medical metaphor often. If the doctors aren't allowed to make an accurate diagnosis, it makes it very difficult to come up with a compelling prescription. And this is part of the difficulty, that the level of communication between the people who live with the challenges and the people who prescribe the mechanisms to deal with the challenges is too wide. So I suppose what I'm asking for here, based on Thurman's insights and astute observations, are that we need a more honest and debate and a closer relationship between community, academia, politicians, and people in charge of public bodies. We basically do not have that honesty at the minute to be able to devise more realistic mechanisms to help the speaker group in the actual crisis they live with. So I think I'll leave it like that, Gordon. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Crawford. That's kicked us off nicely. You've given us a concise description, and I'm glad, in a sense, that you've also finished with what's basically a question. This is the first of three, and we are addressing the question of trajectory of languages in this first session. And we also want to be fairly broad in our scope. We've kicked off with Gaelic, but we have experts in from other areas as well, and we definitely want to hear what their experiences or how they might compare, and whether, not only in terms of the situation that you've described, but also in terms of the challenges which you've laid out as well. Do these have any reflexes in either India or Jamaica or elsewhere. And I'd invite Udaya to come in first and give us a response to what Crocker said so far.
Thank you, Gordon. And let me begin from where we ended in a few minutes ago. Norman's observations are very pertinent, I would say, because he's giving you the inside view of the trajectory. Somebody who is within the community and looking at the community from within. Now, we as linguists are looking at it from outside, and we are offering certain prescriptions. But these prescriptions are not going to be the same kind of prescription for the entire disease. What happens in case of language endangerment is that there are different kinds of endangerment that different communities feel. I happen to be from a speech community which in 1950s was facing grave danger, because by 1950s, the Maithili speech community lost out, in 1956 in particular, lost out in the case of getting a separate space designated as Mithila. There used to be a whole cultural geographical space called Mithila, which was wiped off because the government set up a states reorganization commission, and the commission decided no, they will continue with the British demarcation of the entire space as Bihar, which has many, many languages, in particular 3 major languages, Maithili, Magahi, and Bhojpuri, and a super language called Hindi, which is their school language, which is the language of the elite, which is the language of the administration. So in 1950s, I saw how exactly the insiders fought. The few people who were insiders and who were leaders like Norman Maclean, they started, first of all, a postcard movement. That there'll be millions of postcards written to the Prime Minister to recognize the language. The movement gained a lot of ground between 1951 or 56 rather, when the states were formed, and 1962, 63, when the educated, erudite, author Prime Minister Nehru decided that he would like to personally see what exactly is the strength of this language. So he came down to his own hometown, Allahabad, to see the book exhibition of what was published in that language. Why is it calling itself a language and not a dialect of Hindi? He was much impressed with the philosophical tradition, with the musical tradition, with the ancient religious tradition, with the tantric tradition, and with, of course, the current writing, body of current writing. So he said, all right, we haven't recognized it in the constitution as an important language of the country, but we will give it a recognition as a literary language. So he actually took it upon himself to push Maithili as a literary language by giving the recognition of Sahitya Academy Award. Now, perhaps you may or may not know that in India there are various levels of recognition. The most important recognition is the inclusion in the 8th schedule of the Constitution, which Maithili is now. In fact, it has reached there. But I'm trying to tell you the trajectory of a language which was once losing out. From there, through certain kind of moves, it has now entered into the Constitution and has become a major language. So at that point of time, it became a language of literature, recognized language of literature. Now, what is important to understand in the Indian context is this is one kind of case where the number was great, but people were not speaking at home. People were feeling ashamed to speak in Maithili in public places. in the offices, even if you know that the other guy is a speaker of the same language, you wouldn't speak it. You would rather speak to him or talk to him in Hindi. So that was the kind of situation. From there, today, people who are very highly educated, sophisticated, studied abroad, come back to India and they proudly say that I am a Maithili speaker and they would love to speak in the language. So that is a change of attitude. I think this is very important. In case of Gaelic, the change of attitude will have to be worked upon. How is, of course, the insiders must say how exactly that could be done. It could be done in many, many ways. There could be funding which is available for the competitions of recitation, of enactment, of writing, creative writing, of public speaking competitions, and various other kinds of devices, right at the school to the other levels. So I think that is something which we need to work upon. It's not just a prescription from outside that will work. That's great. Thank you very much, Uday. That helps to contextualize. I note there the debate which you referred to about dialect versus language, for example, the different uses which languages might be felt to be put to, and also the notion that a trajectory needn't be one way, that things can go up as well as down sometimes, depending on context and who the actors are and what heft they can pull, as it were. But I won't say more on that at the moment, and I'd like to ask Joseph to give us a perspective from Jamaica now, and see what he's pulled out from what we've heard so far. Go ahead, Joseph.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. So I might give you more than Jamaica. Okay. And why I'm giving you more than Jamaica is because Jamaica is not such a perfect fit. If we look at the issues raised by Norman in that interview. And here I'm launching from the contribution made by Conchúr about majority culture, minority culture, and how very slippery those terms are. Because even if we find today that the minority culture is the culture that is losing its language, invariably, if we go back in time, we find out that they were once the majority culture. So the question is, how did we get here? How do we get to a point where people give up their language? And here I wanted to bring in agency and the human factor, because it is very easy to forget that what we're talking about are language systems used by people existing within communities. And so we have to look at what people are doing, and what people are doing will give us some idea about why we are seeing a particular trajectory. Now, there's a quotation that I like. I've forgotten the quotation in exact words. I can't quote it verbatim. But essentially, it says that what we think about languages is really a reflection of what we think about the speakers. Yeah. So if we think that the language is ugly, if we think the language is aggressive, it's really because that is what we think about the speakers of the language. And I'm raising that to say that what we see happening with language is really what is happening to the speakers of the language. And here, again, I'm bringing in Conchúr's point about the socioeconomic changes and how those impact what people are doing. Now, the assumption made by many people. Is that one language is better than another? And so, of course, the better language wins. If English wins out in a specific community, clearly it must be that English is a better language. And so the speakers give up their language for the better language. But we know that this is not really true. What we really should be looking at is what is the status of the various members of the community in terms of socioeconomics, in terms of political power, etc. And that will give us greater insight about the trajectory that we see. I am mentioning socioeconomics and political power. This is because those are the things that will determine whether or not a speaker gives up his or her mother language for another language. And it comes down to what is the benefit for retaining this thing. And so if you exist in a community where education is done in a particular language that is not your mother language, if all government services are offered in that language and not your mother language, if when you apply for jobs, the job ads say should be a good speaker of X language, which is not your mother language, then you're going to ask yourself, what is the point of my mother language? And then you're going to move, as you move into child rearing, you're going to ask, does it make sense to pass this thing on to my children if it will have no practical benefit for them? And so that is why I wanted to start out with not so much the language, but the speakers and the sort of power that they have or do not have in the community. And so to bring in Jamaica as I close, that is essentially what we find, in that Jamaican Creole for a very long time had low prestige because the people who spoke it were first not thought to be people, and then were at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And things didn't start to change until those people kind of came into their own. And then there were certain cracks in the wall that was before them, that now some people could access money, access wealth without being speakers of English. And here I'm talking about musicians, singers, yeah, whether that's reggae or dancehall, who could make it to the top without necessarily being speakers of English. And so that whole architecture that had been constructed on top of English started to wobble. And I think that's the only way that one can see a change in the sort of trajectory that Norman is talking about. So really and truly, it's starting to change the value of the language by giving it real value and not just cultural value. So what are the jobs that are required? You know, which jobs require use of Gaelic? When a child is educated in Gaelic, what are the opportunities? What scholarships are there that ask for them to be Gaelic speakers? And I think in that way, we can change the trajectory because people will have something to work towards where the language is concerned.
That's great. Thanks very much again, Joseph, for another important brick in the wall that we're trying to build here. Really substantial, and you're touching on issues. I mean, our 3 clips over the series are linked, obviously, and in some respects, it's quite artificial to break them up. Talking about, for example, whether one language might be considered better than another. That obviously links into the whole question of language hierarchies, which we're hoping to deal with as well. And also, I was glad to hear you talk about the transmission question, because I think that perhaps leads us quite nicely into our second set of participants coming from outside academia, people who are working with languages, you know, in various ways, either professionally, but also in personal terms or in community terms. So I'm very glad that all 3 of both, well, Kalyan and Audrey and Jane, they've all worked with languages as teachers or coordinators and so on and so forth, making sure people at community level have access one way or another through a preferred means of communication if possible. So there's that professional side, but also a personal side, which they might wish to offer in response to what we've heard so far, so that we can, I mean, it's been very grounded already, but let's keep it that way and try and put some cement in between the bricks, if you like, which will make them stick together. Could I go with you first, Jane, as we're starting with Gaelic? So if you could make your points first, that would be great.
I'll try to be the cement. Can I just thank everyone? It's been fascinating to listen to you already, all these perspectives, and it's pinging. I'm sure any Islander or Gael listening would think, yes, I know that, I recognize that. The main points, I suppose, that I pick up on are to do with the hierarchies and social subordination, and you know, the benefit of prestige as well. I suppose what's true for us in the islands that there are 2 kinds of Gaelic. There's that of the family, the intergenerational transmission, where we speak very localized Gaelic, which is why before we started to record, I was teasing Gordon a little about his used Gaelic. We have all these different Gaelics, and what came in the 80s was a standardized form approved by universities. And actually, the subordination started to happen not between English and Gaelic communities, but within Gaelic. There was, you know, the new Gaelic of people, you know, many of whom were originally vernacular speakers, some who were new speakers, speaking this very specific, very prestige laden, a different kind of prestige laden language. And the subordination came within Gaelic at that point. The qualification that I got in school as a native speaker was done away with. You can't have native speaking Gaelic anymore. It has to be the approved GME Gaelic. And so anyone who didn't, you know, that was quite a new thing when I was, you know, when my daughter was young, I sent her to GME. I was dubious about it because it was untested, and, you know, she preferred maths, and maths isn't really, we count in 20s, you know, it's not easy to do through Gaelic. So
let me just interject to point out that GME is a shortening, yes, for Gaelic Medium Education.
Gaelic Medium Education. And, you know, one of the reasons I wanted to was because I was immersed in English. That was how I learned English from the age of 4 to 7. And it's torture, it's such hard work. But you do have to do it. We need English. We wouldn't be able to speak to each other without it today. And so I was keen that my daughter would not have to go through that torment quite so young. But what I learned was that it was a different Gaelic, and that it created a kind of schism. You know, Udaya was speaking about, you know, competitions like the Mod, which my generation really enjoyed. But once it came to this much more scrutinized, state-funded thing, the mod became very competitive, and they didn't really want us to learn songs, or children to learn songs using our own vernacular. You know, I can remember doing songs with my daughter in a US accent because it was so important to win at the mod. So it was no longer our Gaelic. And that actually created a schism in community, and it runs through to this day. And that in some way might be why the youngsters in US were a little uncomfortable with Norman, because they might have thought, well, I don't speak Gaelic like that. So within Gaelic itself, I think is where we've had the biggest problems, rather than from English for, you know, the generation maybe who are 30 years old now. So that's a little different for us, but you know, everything that is said is true. You do need to see the benefit of speaking your vernacular tongue, but for us, quite often there's a cost in speaking it because the prestige is elsewhere, and there is no prestige in speaking vernacular Gaelic. So that's a big problem. But I think, Joseph said, you know, you have to make the effort yourselves. You have to put the work in to see how you can rebuild yourselves. But it's not an easy thing because it's not supported by government at all. The opposite has been supported, despite the great many people seeing the value of vernacular Gaelic and all the variations. So that's all I would say if you want an island's perspective on it.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jane. Very honest portrayal of how you see things. And it's not often easy to actually talk in those kind of terms about internal community tensions, as it were. But I think that's perhaps part of the wider point that Crocker is making, that in terms of, if you want to build something, you need to make sure that you've got solid foundations and you're not trying to construct a castle on sand. So these kind of reflections need to be part of what goes into you know, the rethinking which is perhaps necessary. Norman himself talked about the challenges which he felt that parents of Gaelic speakers might have. So, and I'm just wondering if that experience is replicated with diaspora communities which are more recently settled. And maybe Audrey, you might like to reflect on that, or any other points which you've come across so far which have struck something with you.
Thanks everyone for your depth response to the video we've just seen. And I've got, I mean, my brain's pinging all over because I want to reply to everybody's comments. And one, just to go back to Joseph's point about Jamaican, one of the people who helped me hold on to Jamaican was the Honourable Miss Louise Bennett. When we were kids, we listened to her on the radio and we had fun listening to her. And when I came to the UK, even though we spoke Jamaican, it was like it wasn't allowed, but we did it as kids. You know, I remember learning to have to learn English, even though Jamaican sounds like English. And I'm conscious that the response I got wasn't that I was speaking English, it was like something else. So I learned to speak what we considered proper English. But to see somebody garner the language in poetry and in a book and have it written down was very important for me because I was a reader. And also I liked poetry. So it really sort of inspired me on lots of levels. And my family was surprised because I was a reader and, you know, I was supposed to speak proper English, but, you know, you grow up on the streets in the sense of London. So you spoke between Cockney, between proper English. It's quite interesting, the levels where you knew which one to use. And with my friends and family, when we were having fun, we spoke Jamaican, and I associate fun with Jamaican on lots of levels, but also deep emotion with Jamaican. And it's really interesting because that's what Jamaican as my mother tongue does. You know, I don't do code switching. When I'm Jamaican, I'm Jamaican, you know? So what's interesting, back to the family, is that I actually selected to be with a Jamaican person, thinking that we could sort of share culture. And so when I had a baby, the natural instinct was to speak to my baby in Jamaican. It was like shocked. Don't speak to the child in that gibberish. And I was like, oh my God. You know, because it was so natural for me to speak to the child, you know, come on, Picnic, all right, you ready? You know, to the baby. And it was like, you know, he was having a panic attack, actually. So I thought, oh dear, cool it. So my poor daughter, she hears Jamaican, she hears me speaking to one of my best friends in Jamaican, and she's very good at languages. I mean, very good at accents, but she cannot speak Jamaican. And some of those were, you know, because English and Jamaican, we kind of think it's a continuum, and one is bad and one is good. And over time, I've got to recognize that, I mean, what I heard was the comparison of Spanish and Portuguese. And that makes sense to me because I understand some of those Latin languages. So when, for instance, I met a Brazilian person in Spain, he said, ha, 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 they speak like babies. And it was like, oh, it's quite interesting how they have a different ear for the language. And it's that, I think, back to the point about the popularization of language, because it's moving it from bad to good, whatever bad and good is, whatever opportunity is, and so on. So interestingly, I'm in Wales, and it's quite interesting to think about what is top down, bottom up, because Wales is an official language in so many ways. Where I live, it's not spoken, but I've tried to learn some, and people appreciate that. But it is a dual language country now. And it was, I think it's both top down and bottom up. And with all the sort of ramifications that a lot of you have described in terms of, is it a cultural language? And I think Welsh became a cultural language. It's become an official language. But there's something about that pride in a language that means that somehow you keep it at home if you don't lose it elsewhere. And I think keeping the language at home is really important, because then you don't lose it. So I don't know. I mean, I was forced to lose my language at home, and I felt very sad about it, but I've still got it internally. So just wonder where we go with that.
Thanks very much again, Audrey, for another fantastic contribution. The emotional intensity and the affective nature of the language of the home, I'm glad you brought that out. It's when we're talking about social structures, it can sometimes feel a bit disembodied. So it's as well to remind ourselves that there are quite deep affective strands to this whole debate. So thanks for that. You also touched on the question of top down, bottom up, and what kind of strategies might work. And you brought in that comparison with Welsh in Wales, which is obviously something which the Gaelic communities in Scotland look at from time to time, and you know, to an extent, might wish to model their own strategies on that, and perhaps we'll hear more views about how appropriate that is. But it's as well to have it marked so that you know, it's a salient issue, and we need to think about it carefully. So thanks for bringing in all those points. Kalyan, you've been very, very patient. I know that you will probably have all sorts of questions, as well as your own experiences to relate. So I'm really going to hand you a blank slate now, and let you give us the benefit of what your thoughts have been so far.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I will really deliberately speak as a non-specialist and an outsider, and I will possibly not stick to a purely linguistic framework for reasons that will become clear. I'll try and use my 5 minutes well and speak relatively fast. I thought that Croher's extrapolation of Norman's clip was fantastic, and I felt immediately at home. Because previous to coming in, I thought I'd get lost in this whole thing because I'm not a linguist as such. But he laid out some stuff, and he hit on key questions that also I would have highlighted. For instance, the question of public policy. What is public policy? And in my opinion, public policy, whether it's language policy or any other policy, is at bottom of political policy, which Joseph touched on very well. And so why do these insights not filter down is a political question, in my opinion. And the politics ultimately boils down to not so much a matter of good ideas or bad ideas, or good motives or bad motives. It is ultimately, historically, a question of material incentives, material exigencies, material imperatives. And so if you look at Gaelic, for instance, I'm no expert on the history of the British Isles or Gaelic, but just at a glance, the things that struck me when I went on the internet to find out about it was things like 1609 Statutes of Iona. Well, what was that about? It was about the so-called commercialization, which Croher calls modernization. 1609, way back then, commercialization of landlords, basically leading to the Highland clearances of 1750 to 1860, which was basically capitalism. Let's call a spade, right? And that's what Joseph talks about. He talks about it's ultimately at bottom socioeconomic and political. And today, the framework in which we're operating, whether it's Gaelic or otherwise, in most of the world is capitalist. So to have Maithili, for instance, included in the Indian capitalist constitution is to be welcomed, but untouchability was made illegal at its birth in the constitution, and it continues to this day in India. So it gives you a measure of how effective a capitalist constitution can actually be in implementing things on the ground in ways that are actually effective and not reversible. So a lot of these things, like Robert Owen's New Lanark movement, was a good idea, but not replicable. It was reversible, because at the end of the day, the main motive that animated the entire socioeconomic framework of this country and this society was private profit, and that hasn't changed. And so to quickly conclude on sort of, I'll use another example, for instance, in India, for instance, apart from untouchability, on the question of language, for instance. Udaya may be particularly aware of this recent furor, among many others, of where an ad company had to withdraw and apologize for using an Urdu phrase, Jashne, what was it? Jashne Riwaz, instead of Shubh Diwali, because the one Urdu reflected, indicated pro-Muslim bias, apparently, and really irritated the BJP wing. And so they had to apologize and withdraw it, whereas they said that basically we simply meant happy celebrations for the season. So these things, Urdu has long been part of the Indian constitutionally recognized languages of India, but this is the response you get, right? So quickly, to conclude, I would say, as a non-specialist, deliberately so, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. If it's a historical process, there was an alternative historical phenomenon which shook the world literally in 1917. It's called the Russian Revolution. And it implemented a series of edicts, primary among which was a language edict on the question of nationalities and languages. In 1922, education was ordered to be allowed in all minority national languages of the Soviet Union, of the Russian Federation. And this trend lasted till as long as Lenin was alive. It was reversed by Stalin, unfortunately. But Lenin himself, in 1914, Lenin as the leader, as you know, of the Russian Revolution, in 1914, was 3 years before the 1917 revolution, he was already against having any one language even as the Russian speakers, the majority language speaker, any one language as a so-called official language or a national language or a state language. He was dead against it. And it was because he led that revolution, he was able to persuade his own party and the leadership, the government of that country, to allow all languages to be equal. He very much believed it before the revolution, and he very much tried to implement it after the revolution. The reasons why the revolution went to the dogs, after having lasted more or less with its gains for 70 years in one way or another, is a different question. But that model exists in history. And as someone once said, you know, those who refuse to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So we might as well learn something from history.
Great. Thank you very much, Kalyan. Nailing your colors to the mast there. That's good stuff. And coming up with a final point about the question of how language relates to nation, if at all, and how appropriately it does, and whether they map onto each other in any kind of isometric way, if that's the right word. I mean, I think you've raised some very basic, but indeed fundamental questions there, which no doubt do play a part in the kind of deliberations which language planners and others, policymakers, take into account. So we are moving on. You've all spoken well and at some length, but I don't want to just draw things to a close there. Should we just leave it open for any questions by anybody for a couple of 3 minutes, and then I'll perhaps invite Crocker to respond and roll things up altogether. So any points arising? Yeah.
Yeah, can I say a few things about the comments that we received? I think one important point that was made by Kalyan was about the relationship between the politics and language, preservation of language, revitalization of language, and the political connections. If you remember, in 1967, there was a thesis in the University of Pennsylvania by Paul Brass, which became a major book. In 1974, it was published from India, called Language, Religion, and Politics in North India. And he picked up 3 case studies: the Punjabi, the Urdu, and the Maithili. And his basic point was that unless these language movements are connected with either the political factor or the religious factor, they won't succeed as a movement. Later on, some of us, myself, Pradeep Bose, and Rajaram, 2 sociologists, and me, when we worked on it, we predicted in 1970s that there is another factor, which is economics. That is, if you connect these languages into economics, the minority language, minor language, smaller languages into economic factors, then they might succeed. And that's exactly what has happened in case of Maithili. Now, the other point about Jane that she has raised is very crucial about the standardization issue. What kind of Gaelic are we going to talk about? The vernacular Gaelic and standard Gaelic. This was a major conflict even in case of Maithili. There were major writers, editors who evolved ways of spelling, ways of writing, ways of punctuation and everything on detail, grammatical details of the standard language. And that was built around the higher caste, the Brahminical caste. As it was done, it immediately separated all the other castes and communities within Mithila to abandon the language and move over, shift over to some other language, which has changed dramatically now. Because now the new standards, 5, 6 new standards, both dialectal and caste, they've emerged, they've come up very powerfully, and those writers have been all accepted, all revered, and therefore there's greater interest back in writing and using the language, even for literary purposes. So that's one issue. The third point that has emerged is about the what language do you teach your children, which was also raised in another discussion. That when you have a child, and particularly in India, we have seen two things are very crucial in India or in whole South Asia. One is at a given point of time, 20% of the people are on the move. They're shifting from one state, one space to another cultural space, and they're going to relocate themselves. Second is very large number of couples who speak two different languages. So this raising the child is a very major issue here. Which language would you try to inculcate right from the beginning? And a lot of time, children would actually shift to a third language, which is a language of the state, or language of the market, or the language of the official use, etc., etc. So this is a typical problem that emerges. And Norman Maclean, what he said about Gaelic and the younger generation people, and why after a few sentences they would shift back to the language of convenience, which is English. This is very crucial. Just last one point. Very interestingly, when there is a fight between Hindi and the various varieties of Hindi, which is now slowly emerging as separate languages, Hindi did a very interesting, took a very interesting strategy. The Hindi films and the Hindi theater, they started using the dialectal songs, dialectal jokes, and those things, characters speaking in various smaller minority languages, the minority dialects, bring them into the mainstream, onto the screen, and project them. So a lot of richness came into the Hindi film industry because of that. But that is also one of the ways of usurping the smaller and minority languages, that you don't need to speak in their language, just retain your jokes there, retain your songs there, and use it as a cultural tool. So that's a very dangerous thing. So I think these are all issues which are all referred to by Norman, not in the smaller clip that we have seen, but in the bigger context that he's made. Thank you.
Thank you, Udaya. Those are all good points again. I noticed that Joseph has got his hand up. So we are speeding towards a close, but Joseph, please go ahead.
Thanks. So I wanted to say very quickly, and this is piggybacking on Udaya's point, which itself piggybacked on Jane's thing about internal politics in the community, especially with regard to standardization. And I know Norman in that video essentially was doing a eulogy for Gaelic. For him, he wasn't very optimistic that things would improve. But then, language planners and activists try to move against the tide, try to go against the tide very often. But Udaya and Jane reminded me that we have to be so very careful that in the process of trying to revitalize, we don't copy the same sort of politics of marginalization that we are trying to battle. And so we have to think very carefully about how we go about standardization. And truth is that languages existed for thousands of years without the sort of standardization that we think of these days when we think about standardization. So we have to say to ourselves, okay, we want to move the language into X domain, whether that's government services. But in moving it into that particular domain, is there a need to create a specific variety of the language for that domain? Why can't the language as it is used by the people? So if the whole purpose is to help the people to access services, why then would you now put on another layer that they have to access it in the way that you say, as opposed to accessing it in the way that, that is more natural for them, which was the whole point about bringing their language into that space. And so I'd say, if anything that we take away from this, it's really for activists, for language planners, linguists, to be more self-reflexive and to think about how we go about these things so that we end up empowering and not further marginalizing.
Thank you. Wise words indeed. Thanks very much, Joseph. I sense that there's an awful lot more that all of us could say. We do have the fallback of sections 2 and 3, assuming that we all liked what we did today. So I do think I want to just draw a line under this just now, but definitely and certainly like to continue this conversation in the context which we've already foreshadowed, as it were. But I do want to give Crocher one last shot, just to sum things up for today at least, before we close for today and then hopefully reconvene again, not too distant future.
Thank you, Gordon. Just to sum up, I just have to say it's been such a rich exchange. And again, to thank you, Gordon, for thinking of the idea and bringing us all together. We can see how these issues, they're complex and interesting. They're good issues. And even though we can see how difficult they are to deal with from a political or a policy point of view, because it's the way the issues of emotion or the affective issues, as you're talking about, Gordon, interrelates with status issues, socioeconomic change, societal change, and then in the context of transmission and acquisition. And then, of course, this all boils down to a group in crisis has to make decisions, or decisions are made for them, negative or positive. So we can't really, we have to react in some way. And to draw it back to Norman, that he's looking over the span of his life, and he's wondering what's going to happen now, because the Gaelic world has changed to its detriment to a large extent because of the influence of the new social players and ineffective policy. But if we're to draw everything together, I'm struck by Jane and Audrey's piece about how personal identity, this is the affective issue, interacts with collective identity. And this is what makes it so difficult, that you're dealing with different competing collective perceptions. And Joseph makes this point as well, that the status of a language group, there's an issue of self-perception in it, but then that contends also with how the competing culture, the perception from the outside. And as Udaya says, that you have to make choices. You have to devise a feasible approach in the context of change. In other words, you can make decisions that make things worse. But the core issue, and many have talked in this in Kalyan's piece as well, the importance of having the ability to acquire it and acquire it well and be educated in it, is the issue of transmission and acquisition. And I suppose just to bring it all back to Thurman or Norman, what I think we need to do at some level is to listen and to be a bit more relaxed. If we're relaxed, we will listen to different perspectives in a more open sense. Part of the difficulty comes from having a highly threatened group subject to control structures in policy. I think there is far too much top-down planning for endangered groups rather than grassroots or bottom-up planning meeting top-down planning somewhere in the middle. What comes with an imbalance in top-down planning is that policy tends towards gatekeeping. In other words, those who hold power in official bodies, who hold the purse strings, they gatekeep among clients who tend to engage in or facilitate control mechanisms rather than allowing this relaxed exchange of ideas where we can come up with Udaya's point, with the most feasible approach to improve conditions. So in honor of our good friend Norman, I suppose to boil that all down, what I would say is, first of all, we need to listen to each other, to listen to the people who live with the difficulty, and all the participants to engage in a relaxed discussion with a view to coming up with a better, more feasible approach to help these communities in crisis.
Thanks, Conchúr, for those final thoughts. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you to all that took part: Conchúr, Udaya, Joseph, Jane, Audrey, Kalyan, and we certainly hope that viewers found this interesting. Links are posted below, both to the full segment of Norman's thoughts that we were discussing today, plus to the entire Sir Haramich or Norman's World collection of recordings that I mentioned at the beginning. We will also put some links to relevant project or institutional sites that you may wish to explore if you want to read a bit further. We certainly hope you do. Thank you very much.